Welcome, rational thinkers and champions of evidence-based reasoning, to the Free of Faith podcast. This is the place where we dare to peel back the comforting but opaque layers of faith-based claims and expose their logical shortcomings. Today, we turn our attention to a pillar often held up as undeniable proof of divine authorship: biblical prophecy. How well do these supposed predictions hold up when examined with reason rather than reverence? Let's begin with a simple illustration. Suppose a friend tells you that his parents, long before he was born, accurately predicted his future. They had predicted he'd get a haircut before college, marry a European woman, and become a doctor who owns a boat. Intrigued, you ask to see the original notes. What you find is more like,
"Our kids will probably do well, perhaps marry someone interesting, and maybe live near the ocean."
Suddenly, the aura of predictive brilliance fades. These were not specific predictions. They're generalized, open-ended musings that are easy to retrofit to later events. This example helps us frame the problem with biblical prophecy. When examined closely, many of these so-called prophecies exhibit characteristics that actually undermine their credibility. They're vague, highly flexible, and often applied retroactively. For a prophecy to convincingly demonstrate divine origin, it should be unambiguous, time-bound, and resistant to manipulation. This is rarely what we find in Scripture. Take, for instance, Ezekiel's proclamation that Tyre would be utterly destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and never be rebuilt. History reveals that Tyre survived the siege, continued to flourish under Greek rule, and remains inhabited to this day. The New Testament fares no better when it comes to clarity. In Matthew 24, Jesus references a parable of the fig tree and tells his followers, "This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." Taken plainly, this implies that the end of the age would occur within the lifetimes of those hearing him. When that didn't happen, the interpretation of generation began to evolve. This kind of interpretive fluidity may preserve belief, but it also undercuts the very concept of prophecy as a testable claim. Another oft-cited example is the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, a text many Christians believe describes Jesus' crucifixion. However, this passage is not self-evidently messianic. Isaiah 53 does refer to a servant who is pierced and bears the suffering of others. Yet scholars point out that this servant was traditionally understood to represent Israel as a nation, not an individual Messiah. Bear in mind how familiar the Gospel writers were with the Old Testament. They didn't simply record events and later discover prophetic parallels. They had those texts in hand and could have easily postdictively shaped their narratives accordingly. Jesus riding a donkey into Jerusalem is one example, echoing Zechariah 9:9. But when a prophecy is well known and the authors are consciously constructing a theological narrative, it becomes nearly impossible to distinguish fulfillment from postdiction. This concept of postdiction, or predicting after the fact, requires consideration. This tactic was readily available to the writers of the New Testament, who religiously read the Old Testament scriptures. Daniel 11 offers a striking example. The chapter lays out an extended narrative involving a king of the north and a king of the south, mirroring the real-world conflicts between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties. The level of detail is so precise that many scholars conclude it was composed after these events occurred. Tellingly, the narrative becomes vague and inaccurate the moment it moves into future territory, further suggesting that its apparent predictive power was merely the product of hindsight. Even more revealing are the so-called prophecies in Matthew that cannot be found in the Old Testament. Matthew 2:23 claims that Jesus' residence in Nazareth fulfills the prophecy. He shall be called a Nazarene. But no such prophecy appears anywhere in Hebrew Scripture. What's more, many of these prophecies involve themes so universal that they require no divine insight to anticipate. In Matthew 24, Jesus mentions wars and rumors of wars as signs of the end. But instead of remarkable predictions, these are ongoing features of human history. Their perpetual recurrence ensures that any generation can claim to be living in prophetic times. This is precisely what many believers do today. One common defense is that prophecy is purposely ambiguous, designed to provoke faith, not certainty. But if that's true, then prophecy ceases to constitute evidence. Another argument is that many prophecies are symbolic and therefore require interpretation. But symbolism, by its nature, is flexible. When anything can be reinterpreted to fit the text, the claim to divine precision collapses. Some Christians point to detailed examples, such as Jesus being born in Bethlehem or descending from David's line. But these specifics, too, are found in the very Old Testament scriptures that the Gospel writers had read. These details could have easily been intentionally incorporated to match messianic expectations. The literary shaping of Jesus' story to align with existing prophetic motifs could easily have been a theological project of the writers. To conclude, the pattern of vagueness, flexibility, and retroactive alignment suggests that biblical prophecy is a human construct, not a divine communication. Second, the most precise predictions tend to occur after the events have already happened, classic postdiction. Third, when belief in prophecy depends on shifting definitions and reinterpreted timelines, it begins to strongly resemble superstition rather than rational inference. If this conversation has sparked some questions or even some discomfort, that's a good thing. Questioning is the first step toward clarity. Don't settle for easy answers or platitudes. Dive deeper, explore further, and demand evidence. Head over to Free of Faith to read the full article and join the discussion. Let's keep this conversation going, because the pursuit of truth doesn't stop at questioning. It's about finding answers that actually make sense. Thank you for tuning in to the Free of Faith podcast, where we expose the logical failings of faith and celebrate the clarity that comes with reason. Until next time, stay skeptical, stay curious, and remember, rationality always outperforms faith. Engage reality, and I'll see you soon.